You've probably seen this picture before. In 1870, the High Plains contained some 8 to 10 million buffalo. By 1883, they were almost extinct. There were approximately 456 bison left on the continent in 1892 when this picture was taken. Not long ago, Westerns were a major piece of our pop culture diet. Pulp fiction, Saturday morning serials, epic movies. There was a time when John Wayne and every imitator of John Wayne dominated the box office simply by riding a horse and spanking their love interest into submission. Times have changed. Now the spanking is inappropriate. It's kind of funny to me that most people's exposure to the Western genre is through narratives that critique the Western genre. The good, the bad, and the ugly, Unforgiven. I mean, the modern Western has almost become synonymous with the revisionist Western, narratives that self-consciously critique the tropes and themes of the genre, usually to comment on something called the American dream. What is that? What used to be iconoclastic has now become the icon. Enter Zoomers. Their exposure to Westerns is through three paths. Django Unchained, Red Dead Redemption 2, or Wendigoon's video on Blood Meridian. Look, this video isn't about Blood Meridian, but what was once considered an esoteric experimental work of art has become a household name, and that's crazy. Part of it's got to be because of McCarthy's own explosion as a public figure since the 1980s when Blood Meridian was published, but some of it's because of our society's attraction to truly transgressive art, work that is shocking. In a world of true crime podcasts, there's something darkly mysterious about picking up a book that is considered unfilmable due to its graphic content. It's scary. Today, I'd say there are two Western novels that the general public is aware of. Lonesome Dove, that's the one they actually read, and Blood Meridian, the one they watch video essays about on YouTube.com. I'm here to argue that a third book belongs in that pantheon, and good for you, it has a film adaptation. Starring Nicolas Cage, of all people. I'll get to the movie later. Trust me, I'll get to it. It's what Bret Easton Ellis called a precursor to what Cormac McCarthy would do with the genre. Butcher's Crossing. The novel stands on a precipice between old and new, between classic and revisionist. The novel's become more widely read, I suspect, because its author, John Williams, not that John Williams, has had 4 of his novels brought back into print by the New York Review of Books. His novel of academia, Stoner, has gathered a sort of cult following. I think people enjoy his books because they're short, well-structured, and because his prose is precise, clean, and concrete. And because he just had a knack for perfect book titles. Nothing But the Night? I mean, imagine any name besides Stoner. Williams himself said, "I write for the reader more than I write for myself. The reader who puts down 10 or 12 bucks for a book deserves some respect and consideration." It's an attitude I think a lot of modern readers appreciate. There's depth and precision in his craft, but he's still interested in telling a good story. Where Blood Meridian's violence is surreal and oddly detached, Butcher's Crossing's violence is realistic and confrontational. Butcher's Crossing is a brutal novel. A novel of mythic, biblical disasters and horrifying, mechanized killing. It's a story of a horrific buffalo hunt and the men who get destroyed by it. It's rooted in historical fact, but so relevant to today. As noted in the introduction to the novel, Butcher's Crossing was published as the first American troops landed on Vietnamese soil. There's an immediacy to the book, partly because it's rooted in tough, concrete language and lengthy descriptions of things. I came out of it feeling like I could mount a buffalo hunt and survive the Rocky Mountains if I wanted to. But I don't want to, and neither will you by the end of this. I'm going to dissect the novel, see why it works, why it matters, and see how Williams pulls it all off. If you are, like I suspect, a terminally online binger of video essays who reads half a book a year, I'll be summarizing and exploring the whole text. To put it simply, spoiler alert, just watch the video, wait a few years, then read the book once you've forgotten everything I've said. YouTube watch time is my buffalo. And I must done. So I hyped up this book as a brutal revisionist Western, full of blood and guts and turmoil and whiskey and blood and guts. It is, but it's also a comedy. Part 1. Are you stupid? The tension at the heart of Butcher's Crossing can be seen before the book even starts. It's found in these 2 epigraphs, the first by Ralph Waldo Emerson, the second by Herman Melville. Transcendentalism was a major philosophical and artistic movement in the United States that is strongly linked to Romanticism. Leading the pack were Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. If you see a floating eye in the sky, don't panic. That's just your high school buddy Dave who smoked a lot of weed and read Waldo. Herman Melville, the author of that big book about whales, was not a huge fan of transcendentalism. In his novel The Confidence Man, Melville spends a huge number of pages parodying a figure remarkably close to Emerson called the mystic. So with these quotes juxtaposed against each other, Williams' dramatic interests become clear. Emerson and Thoreau both offered qualities which Melville could admire, but his judgment of them is critical. His attack is aimed directly at the center of their thinking, of their abstract approaches to life's problems. Transcendentalists were, and still are, criticized as dreamers, people hoping to shed modern conventions and become one with an oversoul, which is found in nature. I can't even tell you how many times I've seen discourse on Twitter about how while Thoreau was roughing it on Walden Lake, his mom did his dirty laundry. I don't even know if that's true, but it feels true. Melville said of Emerson, his gross and astonishing errors and illusions spring from a self-conceit so intensely intellectual. Another species of Mr. Emerson's errors, or rather blindness, proceeds from a defect in the region of the heart. Ouch! It's important that Williams quote The Confidence Man rather than Moby Dick, because I think a quote from Moby Dick would be a little too on the nose, right? It would give the game away a little bit. Another Ishmael escaping the woes of the world on a treacherous mission to kill some animals. So these two quotes are in direct communication with each other. Williams is not an elusive author. He has a point and he's going to make it effectively in as few words as possible. We're going to witness a battle between dreamers and the nameless, unfathomable void. We sure love the void, folks. Our point of view character is a dummy. Sorry, a very naive individual. From the opening pages, we have little sense of who our protagonist is. It's 1873, and a single passenger rides a wagon into a small Nebraska boomtown called Butcher's Crossing. He's a man in his early 20s with hair the color of Virginia tobacco. The description evokes a type of American aristocracy. This passenger is someone of the upper classes. Williams describes in vivid detail the sights, sounds, and smells of the town. We experience the world exactly as our nameless protagonist experiences it. A voice rose in anger, someone laughed, a horse snorted and neighed, and a bridle jingled at a sudden movement. The faint odor of manure was locked in the hot air. Our boy sure loves his semicolons, huh? The town itself could be taken in almost at a glance. A group of 6 rough-frame buildings was bisected by a narrow dirt street. There was a scattering of tents beyond the buildings on either side. So finally, after 4 pages, when our protagonist checks into a hotel, we learn his name. Will Andrews. Sorry for my artistic skill. I know it's really good, and I don't want you all to get jealous. There is nary an internal thought. Oh no, just the mud and the dust and the sweat. On page 5, we finally get inside Andrews' brain. His mind went back over the way he had come. If I make this sound more experimental than it is, I apologize. You know, it's your basic stranger rides into town story. Nothing strange or abstract here, which makes it all the more engrossing. The book really makes you feel like Will Andrews. Andrews has been traveling for 2 weeks from Boston. Why? The author is not interested in telling us that just yet. We are in the mind of Andrews, trying to absorb meaning in nature through sheer observation. But his reflections make it clear that he's invested in something beyond getting a job. He felt that the sounds of laughter, the voices, the subdued thumps and gratings, the jinglings of bridle bells and harness chains all proceeded from his own head and whirled around there like wind in a hollow sphere. His worldview is solipsistic, born out of a faith that the physical world is responsive to his mental one. The next day, Andrews visits an older man named J.D. McDonald, who runs a business in town, an office that buys and trades buffalo hides. Andrews gives him a letter from his father, a Unitarian minister in Boston. The letter asks McDonald to find work for his son. You know, this whole interaction is really funny because Andrews is like, hey, you left a huge impression on my dad when you attended his church in Boston. He loves you so much. You're awesome. And McDonald just says, listen, boy, I went to your father's church because I thought I might meet somebody that would give me a better job. McDonald, taking pity, offers Andrews a job anyways. This office is a mess, and hey, you know, this college kid might be able to organize it. But, oh no, our beautiful Boston boy wants nothing to do with that. Having dropped out after his 3rd year at Harvard, Andrews doesn't want an office job. He wants to see the West. After mentioning the hunters who sell McDonald his hides, Andrews perks up a little bit. He wants to meet the cool guys, not the pencil pushers. He wants to meet those on with the horses and the guns and all that crap. Who can blame him, really? McDonald says, don't tell me you're like the other young'uns that come in here. You start going out with those men, it'll ruin you. Andrews tries to explain what he feels, why he's out here, and Williams gives him a moving passage of deep yearning. It was a feeling, it was an urge that he had to speak. But whatever he spoke, he knew would be but another name for the wildness that he sought. It was a freedom and a goodness, a hope and a vigor that he perceived to underlie all the familiar things of his life, which were not free or good or hopeful or vigorous. It goes on. So Andrews searches the local saloon for this Miller that McDonald spoke of. He finds 2 men and a woman drinking together at a dining table. Our first impression of the hunter Miller is of toughness. His skin was slightly yellowed and smooth like cured leather, and at the corners of his wide mouth, deep ridges curved up to the thick base of his nose. That's Miller right there. Beside him is Charlie Hodge, Miller's cook and campman. He's described as a gray man. I like to picture Walter Brennan for his part. He's older than Miller, but clearly his follower. He offers Andrews a hand to shake, only to reveal that it's gone. Lost in the winter of '62, he says, laughing. Classic Charlie Hodge bit. You gotta love it. Also at the table is Francine, who, let's just say, is a lady of the night. She's very pretty, I must say. Andrews is immediately smitten, as if she's the first woman he's ever laid eyes on. Miller just says, In Butcher's Crossing, a whore is a necessary part of the economy. What a lovely man. Unlike Andrews, Miller gets straight to business. Andrews is like, I just want to see the country, man. To which Miller very rightly asks him, what do you think you can learn from me? We're constantly seeing how embarrassed Andrews is. He has no idea how to interact with these people on the frontier, nor how to articulate what he even wants from them. Miller is a true independent. He doesn't work for McDonald's. I hunt on my own or I don't hunt at all. He talks about buffalo hunting as if it's already a dying industry. He's nostalgic for the old days, and he makes a speech to Andrews about a hidden valley in the Colorado Rockies. A valley he stumbled upon years ago, full of buffalo. He says, I had the feeling no man had ever been in that valley before. Maybe some Indians a long time ago, but no man. Oh, he's just what a charmer. A true American exploring this vast, totally empty and not populated by Native Americans at all landscape. Quick comments like this highlight the lack of a Native American presence in the book. We get one later mention, but their absence makes a statement in itself. At this point in westward expansion, the native population has been so thoroughly diminished that the white characters speak only of them as an afterthought in 1873. Miller really sells this mythical Eden of untouched buffalo to Andrews. He speaks not like a salesman, but a true believer. He doesn't push Andrews into making a deal with him. Andrews actually pushes him. He describes what it would take to form a party and go on a hunt. Andrews is so captured by his tale, he asks, how much money would it take? To which Miller asks him, how much money you got, son? So, not even 24 hours into Butcher's Crossing and maybe an hour into conversation with a complete stranger, this 22-year-old college dropout is offering to finance a buffalo hunt. Sounds smart. So Miller quotes him about $600 to fund everything, including the horses, supplies, the guns. $600 is about $15,000 in today's money. It's half of all the money Andrews has. The profit split would be 60% Miller, 40% Andrews. Miller will cover Charlie Hodge and Andrews will cover a Skinner. Andrews flat out says, do you want the money now? And Williams writes, the corners of Miller's mouth tightened in a close smile. You don't lose any time making up your mind, do you, Mr. Andrews? So here we go. Miller takes the money and rides off to fetch the supplies in another town. At this point, a normal person might be worried that they've just been scammed. Not our lovable protagonist. No. He spends his days daydreaming in town, snoozing, and waiting for Miller's return. He admires the landscape as if it were an intimation of some knowledge he had long ago lost. He thought now of those early explorers who had set out upon another waste, salt and wide. Williams writes so beautifully of Andrews' idealism, his total faith in an Emersonian spirit. It never feels insincere. There's truth in Andrews' feelings, in his youthful earnestness, and his longing for a connection to his real self. It's what all of us long for. The comedy and tragedy of the book is that Andrews is just totally unprepared for the hard realities of the world. Andrews chats occasionally with Francine, but he's just so painfully awkward he has nothing to say and starts avoiding her. He's just like me. Just like me for real. He chats with Charlie Hodge, the cook, about the Bible. Charlie is very, very religious, and he seeks out Andrews to talk to because Andrews' dad, remember, is a preacher. Soon, almost to his surprise, it occurred to Andrews that he did not know the Bible well enough to talk about it even on Charlie Hodge's terms. Had not, in fact, ever read it with any degree of thoroughness. His father had encouraged his reading of Mr. Emerson. That explains a lot, actually. Finally, Miller returns with 8 oxen, 3 horses, and a guy named Schneider. Let's put him up. He's important. He's the skinner, the one who will actually skin the buffalo hides when they get to Colorado. They all have another meeting at the local saloon and lay out their plan for the expedition. Schneider will become the perfect foil to Andrews. Schneider is a deeply average man, lacking in imagination unlike Miller, and deeply suspicious and materialistic. A no-nonsense kind of guy, but experienced with the world. Andrews immediately dislikes him, especially after Schneider very openly flirts with Francine. It takes a while to convince Schneider to join the hunt. It's a treacherous, mountainous territory, but Miller promises it'll take only a month or 2. No biggie. They hope to get 1,000 buffalo hides at $4 a piece. $4,000 in today's money is a little over $100,000. Schneider wants to be paid a flat rate though, no profit share. He clearly doesn't believe they're going to be successful at all. Unlike Miller, Schneider is constantly teasing Andrews over his lack of experience and inadequacy. He'll have to teach Andrews everything about skinning buffalo. Andrews gets more and more embarrassed and angry, and it all culminates in Schneider very publicly asking Francine for her, services. They wrap up the meeting and Andrews storms out of the bar. What happens next? is one of the most awkward, uncomfortable, and funny scenes I've ever read in a book. Francine actually follows Andrews out of the bar and leads him up to her room. We quickly realize that Andrews is 100% a virgin and has no idea what to do. Francine seems to like this, actually. "I want you to be soft while you can be," she says. "You'll be back, but you won't be the same." In a world of tough men, Andrews is a curiosity. To Francine's concern, Andrews simply exclaims, "I will only become myself." Knowing where this book goes makes that line 1,000 times more painful. Francine seems to actually want to be with Andrews, and even says she's doing it out of love. But I have an alternate theory. Miller visibly noticed the jealousy Andrews showed when Schneider flirted with Francine. I think Miller asked Francine to sleep with Andrews. Why would he do that? Maybe because he wants the mission to be a success. Maybe he doesn't need any animosity amongst his crew, and maybe he doesn't want some sexually frustrated newbie funding his party. That's just my theory. Or Francine is in love with him. Could be either one. Regardless of Francine's motivations, Andrews rejects her. Instead of connecting with her as a human being, his heart went out to her in an excess of pity. He saw her as a poor, ignorant victim of her time and place, thrust from a great mechanical world upon this bare plateau of existence. A revulsion against the world rose up within him, and he could taste it in his throat. Because Francine exists within this world, within the systems of capitalism, she's pitied by Andrews. To him, she's impure, not so much because she sleeps with strange men, but because she is a product of the modern ills of society, according to Andrews. Andrews' idealism betrays him at this moment. When Francine tries touching him, this dude literally flings himself across the room, trips on a rug, then flees the scene. He spends the rest of his time in Butcher's Crossing before the hunt, you guessed it, in his room, avoiding her. He's just like me. For real. Part 2. Not so tough, are we? Let me paint you a picture of our merry fellowship. We have Miller, the hunter, Schneider, our skinner, and Andrews, our money guy. They're all on horseback. Charlie Hodge, the cook and camp man, rides the wagon full of supplies led by 8 oxen. They depart with no fanfare. These guys aren't friends and never become friends. Williams grounds us in the details of their expedition, the pain, the monotony, as they ride through the Kansas plains toward the Rocky Mountains. I'll try to draw a map of their trail for you. It's supposed to be Kansas and Colorado. They're traveling from Butcher's Crossing over here, where the mythical valley is. There's nothing easy about this journey to someone as fresh as Andrews, and by extension us. Already by noon of the first day, the heat throbbed against Andrews' body, and his head pounded painfully with the beat of his pulse. Already the flesh on his upper thighs was tender from rubbing against the saddle flaps, and his buttocks were numb on the hard leather of the seat. Andrews is a perfect avatar for the audience. He's as inexperienced in the tough life on the frontier as someone from the modern day. You could picture Andrews as a van life vlogger, stripped of his van. Though Williams grounds us in the physical discomforts of the journey, he never reduces it to morbidness or despair. There's an evenness to his writing. A lesser writer might foreshadow impending doom. As a reader, we're captivated by the process. Miller is a competent guide. He offers Andrews advice, telling him things will get less painful as he adjusts. Miller's described here repeatedly as an animal. He sniffs the land like a wolf. It's important because later, Miller will stop being compared to an animal, and by that point, things get very bad. They eat dried fruit and biscuits from the wagon, and by the time they set up camp, Andrews passes out immediately. I'd say they're right around here at this point. Butcher's Crossing isn't real, by the way. I just guessed where it might be. Williams doesn't bore us with the details. After describing a typical day from morning to night, the journey moves fast. The pain dulled after the first days, and a kind of numbness took its place. Jack Bremer writes, the prose renders a numbed state. Things happen, discreet and accidental, as Andrews is pulled through them, and there's no attempt to invest the details with the significance of Andrews' experience of them. He merely sees, records, and moves on. On the journey, they encounter a very small herd of buffalo, but Miller has no interest in them. He says, I've stood at a place like this and looked out, and all I could see was black. 50, 75, 100,000 head of buffalo moving over the grass, packed so tight you could walk on their backs, walk all day and never touch the ground. Now all you see is stragglers, like them out there, and grown men hunt for them. Miller has contempt for the modern hunt. He's a romantic, in a sense, and believes he stands apart from the industry. He represents an American ideal, a total independent. We'll see later how that independence gets corrupted. They have one encounter with Native Americans, but the encounter is brief and sad. Its power lies in its lack of consequence to the narrative. On the flat, hard earth in front of the dugouts, several brown, naked children were playing. Behind the children, near the openings of the dugouts, squatted half a dozen Indians. River Indians, Miller said contemptuously. They live on catfish and jackrabbits. They ain't worth shooting anymore. It's devastating, and Andrews doesn't even react to Miller's cruelty. It's important to note that the near extermination of the buffalo in the 1800s was not a process committed randomly by greedy commercial hunters. John Hanner writes, in the early years of the Grant administration, the hope was entertained that the Plains tribes, now all but completely assigned to reservation lands, could be quickly civilized, quote-unquote, and transformed into docile wards of the government. The federal government watched, like everyone else, the destruction of the buffalo and intentionally did nothing. Columbus Delano, who was appointed Secretary of the Interior in 1871, soon emerged as the spokesman for another approach to the quote-unquote Indian question. And by 1873, he was urging that the destruction of the buffalo of the Western Plains could only hasten the dependence of the Indian on agriculture and force the process of civilization to take its course. And although a bill was passed in Congress to limit buffalo killings, President Grant, probably at the urging of Secretary Delano, elected to kill the bill with a pocket veto. John Williams doesn't bludgeon us with these facts. This would be a different book entirely if he did. The effectiveness lies in what goes unstated. So at this point, they're probably like right here. The following chapter brings us one of the most slowly harrowing sequences of events I've ever read in a novel. And it arrives as accidentally as a car wreck. On the 6th day of their journey, Andrews must make a choice. They've reached the end of the Smoky River Trail and thus the end of the river. Miller says they could follow the river and be a week behind schedule, or they could cut across the land and find water elsewhere. There's water there, he says, for a body that knows where it is. To this, sarcastic Schneider says, Mr. Andrews, you don't look like you ever been thirsty in your life. Real thirsty, I mean. So I guess it won't do much good to ask you what you want to do. Andrews trusts Miller, not Schneider, so they decide to stay away from the trip. Miller thinks they'll find water within a day or so, no biggie. To prepare, Miller crafts a barrel out of canvas and branches. They fill it 3/4 full so it doesn't spill over, then they depart at twilight so as to avoid the heat. Oh god, get your water ready, you might need it. Let's chart their water. After a day of riding, they camp silently. They water the horses and oxen. When an ox had drunk its quota, Miller would say sharply, "That's enough," and kick at the beast as Charlie Hodge tugged its head away. After a single day, the water tank is now 1/4 full. Miller tells the party it should just be one more day till they find water. All night the oxen moan, trying to get into the covered canvas barrel. The next day they make a sluggish pace so as not to overextend their horses. When they eat dry biscuits, Miller tells them to eat very little, because it'll dry them out. Schneider thinks they're lost, but Miller calmly assures them they're just half a day away from water. Trust me, bro. Schneider wants to head south to the Arkansas River, but Miller says it'd be just as bad as turning around. Seriously, trust me, bro. Now, they're so far from a water source it'd be impossible to go back. At this point, Schneider is openly mutinous, but he's the only one. Charlie Hodge is too loyal to Miller, and Andrews is too inexperienced to speak out against him. Since Andrews is funding the party, he makes the executive decision to stay with Miller. They ride into the night. Miller, ahead of them, was a frenzied, hunched figure. And on their 3rd day away from the river, the oxen moaned almost constantly, and their breaths were dry and rasping. Schneider exclaims that they won't make it another day. Furiously, Miller forces the men to gather their personal canteens and dump their water into the barrel. After doing this, there's now only 4 inches of water left. To keep the oxen's tongues from swelling and suffocating themselves, Miller grabs a rag, wets it in the barrel, and individually dampens the oxen's tongues. After this, all that remains is about 1 inch of muddy water. Later, Schneider proposes dumping their provisions to pick up later, but Miller, no surprise, rejects the idea. They'd never be able to find the wagon again if they left it there, he explains. Instead, Miller forces the men to take a shot of whiskey, just to wet their mouths. It seared Andrews' dry tongue as if a torch had been thrust into his mouth. By sundown, Miller again wets the oxen's tongues with a rag. The animals are so depleted they no longer even show interest in the water. By the end of this process, the rag is completely dry. The water is gone. Breathing becomes an effort in agony. At night, Andrews discovers his mouth open and that he could not close it. Party devolves into delirium. The animals can barely walk. Andrews falls asleep on his horse and nearly gets lost. On day 4, Miller finds water. The animals sense its presence before the humans do, and they bolt toward the stream. Instead of immediately gulping from the stream, the men slowly acclimate their mouths to the moisture. This entire ordeal brings them close to death, yet the very next morning, Miller leads the party as if nothing had happened. To a man as experienced as Miller, this is just one of the many hardships of life. He's seen it before and he'll see it again. You'd think this harrowing experience would affect Andrews' worldview, that he'd have a less transcendental view of nature after this. You'd think wrong. It's going to take a lot more to break our beautiful Boston boy. As they enter Colorado and climb up the mountain foothills, Andrews' tender excitement only grows. The sounds of their travels came not from themselves, but from the forest, as if there beat within it a giant heart for anyone known to hear. The Rockies are grand and sublime. Andrews walks up them with renewed longing for a connection to his higher, truest self. Miller struggles to find the paths he trod some decade prior. Across a river, he finds a hidden path that allows the buffalo to ascend to the valley and descend during the winter months. All the men have to do is follow this path. Andrews moves with exuberance, climbing rapidly, ignoring the pace at which the others proceed. He finds out the hard way about altitude sickness. He passes out, then learns to move slowly with the others. At times, the path is so steep the men have to push the wagon to keep the oxen from slipping. By the end of the day, they pulled and pushed the wagon up the last steep ascent. Sweat came out on their faces and was instantly dried by the high, cool air. Below them extends a wide, curving valley. A shifting mass like a black liquid moves over the grass. Miller estimates it's 2,000 to 3,000 buffalo. After nearly 120 pages of doubting Miller's faith, we find his hidden Eden, the last refuge of the buffalo. Part 3. Slaughter. After making camp, Miller's priority shifts immediately to killing, and we see the intricate process by which he makes bullets. It involves melting and casting lead, then packing the cartridges with gunpowder. Schneider teaches Andrews to sharpen his knives to prepare for skinning the hides, and Miller lays out his plans for tomorrow. Here's the plan. The valley is mostly surrounded by sheer rock. It's 25 miles long. There's no way for the buffalo to escape. It'll be like shooting fish in a barrel. The next day, Miller and Andrews stake out a group of buffalo. Miller explains that you must first kill the leader, after which the group just stands there and gets slaughtered. After getting shot through the heart, the old bull turned around several times, as another animal might have done before sleeping. Stiffly, he fell on his side, his legs straight out from his belly. The legs jerked, and then he was still. Miller doesn't even want the leader's hide. He's too old. He just wants to decapitate the herd at the head. About the only amount of self-reflection Andrews shows after the animal gets killed is that he regarded the felled buffalo with some mixture of feeling. On the ground, unmoving, it no longer had that kind of wild dignity and power that he had imputed to it only a few minutes before. The killing escalates quickly. Andrews assists by collecting the cartridges, cooling the hot rifle barrel, and replacing the guns. Pretty soon, he could see the ground in front of him littered with the mounted corpses of buffalo, and the remaining herd, apparently little diminished, circling almost mechanically now in a kind of dumb rhythm, as if impelled by the regular explosions of Miller's guns. Schneider is a little less excited than Andrews, who, has to skin all of the buffalo hides before they stiffen at night. At first, Schneider is faintly amused by the workload, but pretty soon grows furious at Miller, as usual, when Miller refuses to stop killing for the day. At this point, the imagery connected to Miller is not that of an animal, but of a mindless machine driven only to perform one task: kill buffalo. During the last hour of the stand, he came to see Miller as a mechanism, an automaton, moved by the moving herd. And he came to see Miller's destruction of the buffalo not as a lust for blood or a lust for the hides or a lust for what the hides would bring, or even at last the blind lust of fury that toiled darkly within him. He came to see the destruction as a cold, mindless response to the life in which Miller had immersed himself. There's no moral weight given to Miller. There hardly seems any agency or free will. We don't know why he kills. Neither does he, and I find that fact scarier than if he had some pent-up psychological motivation. A Buffalo Oedipus complex, perhaps. Finally, after a bad shot, the herd moves, and Miller must stop shooting for the day. All told, the number of buffalo killed on that day alone is 135. We're going to keep a tally here. Sadly, it's just the beginning. Schneider, unsurprisingly, is a bad teacher. He shows little interest in teaching Andrews how to skin the hides, and Andrews grows increasingly frustrated and embarrassed at his incompetence. Who could have seen this coming? The descriptions of the animal skinning is genuinely graphic. If you are at all squeamish, I suggest skipping over this next passage. With Schneider's left hand, he pushed back the heavy collar of fur around the buffalo's neck, and his other hand made a small slit in the hide and drew his knife swiftly from the throat across the belly. The hide parted neatly with a faint ripping sound. With a stubbier knife, he cut around the bag that held the testicles, cut through the cords that held them and the limp penis to the flesh. He separated the testicles, which were the size of small crab apples, from the other parts of the bag, and tossed them to one side. Then he slit the few remaining inches of hide to the anal opening. "I always save the balls," Schneider said. Because he's Schneider, of course he does. After skinning a buffalo, they pull the hide off with a rope attached to a horse. Andrews' first attempts go wrong. He either cuts too deeply or not deep enough, and the hides get split or they pull off huge chunks of meat. These hides go completely wasted, mind you, and they don't do anything else with the body of the buffalo. Fed up, Andrews returns to camp while Miller and Schneider stay up late skinning all the corpses. Andrews attempts to dress a calf for eating that night, but none of the men are much help to him. He has no idea where or how to cut it, and the intestines and blood spill out all over his clothes. As the day winds down, the men take their places by the fire. There's a sense of happiness all around, but Schneider, asshole he is, decides to bring up Francine for some reason, the prostitute from town. He's clearly trying to bother Andrews, who already feels inadequate after failing all day. Schneider says, "First thing I'm gonna do when we get back to Butcher's Crossing is hire myself a little German girl for a couple of days. If you get in too much of a hurry, Mr. Andrews, you might just have to pull me off." Paternally and as leader of the group, Miller tells Schneider to shut the fuck up. But the thought sticks with Andrews. For the first time in 100 pages, he reflects upon his rejection of Francine, on why he couldn't sleep with her. In the moment before sleep came upon him, he made a tenuous connection between his turning away from Francine that night in Butcher's Crossing and his turning away from the gutted buffalo earlier in the day. Andrew sees the buffalo, like Francine, once proud and noble and full of the dignity of life, now stark and helpless, a length of inert meat divested of itself. Because Francine is a prostitute, because she exists in the physical realm, she is, in Andrews' eyes, a length of inert meat. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say, Andrews, you are a no-good, very problematic boy. Treat women better, my friend. To Andrews, Francine's self was murdered. And in that murder, he had felt the destruction of something within him, and he had not been able to face it. So he had turned away. This is the first step for Andrews. When faced with the reality of a physical, uncaring, immoral world, he turns away in fear, a total rejection. He does the same thing with the buffalo, but you can only stay willfully ignorant for so long, especially when confronted in isolation. Andrews will soon learn this the hard way. After their first day, the killing moves swiftly. It's almost too easy. Miller shoots, Andrews and Schneider skin, and Charlie Hodge feeds them. Andrews compares himself to an automaton. They stack the hides into separate piles, clearing 7 feet high, each stack containing about 90 hides. Then they bind them all with rope. After a week in the valley, they have 10 piles of hides. All right, let's do the math here. That's about 900 hides, 900 dead buffalo, all in a week's work and all shot by one man. Another week passes. Miller goes about his mindless destruction, uninterested in the other men. His face is described as black and dull with powder smoke, his white teeth clenched behind his stretched out leathery lips, and his eyes black and shining in their whites, surrounded by a flaming red line of irritated lids. Everyone's getting restless, but Miller grows more quiet, more intensely focused. Finally, Schneider voices concern. He's tired. He wants some vegetables. Fall is around the corner. They've been up here 2 weeks and killed plenty of buffalo. Miller tells them it'll take only 10 more days to wipe out the entire herd. It becomes clear to them that Miller won't rest until every single buffalo in that valley is dead. So that's what they do. Schneider, being the petty person he is, the ultimate hater, demands his pay regardless. $60 a month. You thinking of spending it right soon? Miller asks. Andrews forks over the $60 to Schneider, and the killing continues. Eventually, the entire valley becomes littered with naked corpses of buffalo. It reeks. The remaining herd wandered placidly among the ruins of their fellows, nibbling at grass flecked with their dry brown blood. It's been 25 days in the mountains and a big change is about to happen. Miller has promised the men just 3 or 4 more days until they can leave. It's a particularly hot day and Miller is having trouble keeping the remaining buffalo from fleeing. He asks Andrews to help him round up the buffalo. They sit at opposite ends of the stampeding herd, firing their weapons, trying to corner them into a standstill. It works. And the small, diminished herd is ready for its final slaughter. Andrews, for some reason, is elated. He marvels at the buffalo's ability to move collectively to act as one organism. To this, Miller says, all a man can do is not think about them. Just plow into them, kill them when he can, and try not to figure anything out. It's right after this that Schneider demands everyone's silence. There's something wrong, something off, but he just can't articulate it. The air is cool and calm. Out of the air, large and soft and slow like a falling feather, drifted a single snowflake. Andrews laughs and says, "Why, it's snowing!" The others aren't laughing. And finally, after 25 days of nonstop killing, Miller listens to his only master, nature. "Let's go," he says. "We might just make it before it gets bad." It's amazing how much someone's life can change in the course of a few minutes. Soon after the first few snowflakes, the air is completely white with snow. The men are in a frenzy to return to camp, and Andrews is just now understanding the gravity of this situation. Charlie Hodge, who lost his hand to frostbite in the winter of '62, becomes helpless, falling into a state of total shock. This is his worst nightmare realized, and from this point onwards, this elderly man will revert to the mentality of a child. Andrews soon loses all feeling in his own hands, along with any visibility of the landscape. He almost loses sight of the others and panics. It's a massive, bitter snowstorm. Miller leads blindly, hoping the horses can find their way. Andrews can barely hear Miller's voice over the howling of the wind. At camp, buffalo hides that haven't been tied down are thrown everywhere or blown into the branches of trees. It's sudden chaos. Already the snow is halfway up to their knees. Miller grabs a few hides and thongs them together, creating like a makeshift sack. He makes one for himself, one for Andrews, one for Charlie, and one for Schneider. You won't be warm, Schneider tells them, but you'll live. And though they are quickly freezing to death in a snowstorm, Fred Schneider has met his absolute limit. "You sons of bitches can go to hell," he says. "Up to now, I've done what you said. I went with you when I didn't want to go. I turned away from water when I knew there was water behind me. I stayed up here with you when I knew I had not to stay. Well, from now on in, I don't want to have nothing to do with you, you sons of bitches. I'm sick of the sight of you. I'm sick of the smell of you. From here on in, I take care of myself." You know what? Good for you, Schneider. No one listens to you, and it's about time you make a stand. I mean, you'll likely freeze to death, but that's not what matters, right? Miller, Andrews, and Charlie Hodge crawl into their buffalo sacks and quickly get buried in snow. It's pitch black, smells like rancid flesh, and to Andrews' horror, the hides are littered with lice and ticks that quickly go to town on his own flesh. Despite the discomfort, Andrews regains some feeling in his body, though he never feels warm. The three men survive the storm, a storm that rages for 3 days, by burrowing inside the skinned hides of the animals they slaughtered. Andrews thinks of Francine. He thought of her as flesh, as softness, as warmth. He thought of her as part of himself that could not quite make another part of himself warm. Somehow he had pushed that part away from him once. A few days prior, Andrews thought of Francine as flesh in a negative context, as if she were inferior to an ideal version of a woman he had in his head. Not surprisingly, buried under feet of snow, that demarcation melts, and she becomes a part of himself. On the third day, the men emerge into an alien landscape, blindingly white in the sunshine. Schneider survived the storm in his own buffalo hide, but Charlie Hodge is completely changed. He barely speaks and is useless when they start a fire. When Miller rides up to the mountain pass to see if it's possible to escape the mountain valley, Charlie Hodge goes into a panic. Schneider comforts Charlie in a rare showing of empathy. Even Schneider can tell Charlie is mentally broken now. When Miller rides back, he confirms what the men gradually come to accept. They're trapped on the mountain and won't be escaping until the snow thaws in the spring. That's 6 to 8 months away. This is their new reality. They have their hides and their health for now, but Andrews is now facing the reality that in 6 to 8 months he will no longer be the same person. Andrews immediately dreads boredom, but soon learns that their days will be full of constant toil. The first thing they do, obviously, is build a shelter, a lean-to, walled and floored with buffalo skins which were thonged and overlaid so that from the back and sides at least it was virtually water and windproof. They fashion masks to avoid snow blindness. They make robes and boots out of buffalo hides. The nights are so cold that Andrews watched the campfire consume a dozen thick logs without once breaking into a flame. That's cold. Miller seems unperturbed by it all, reminding his men that things could be worse. "Why, this ain't bad," he says. "We're set now. I recollect one winter I got snowed up in Wyoming all by myself, clean above the timberline and no way to get down. So high there was no game. I lived all winter off my horse and one mountain goat, and the only shelter I had was what I made out of that horse skin. This is good living." God, Miller is truly built different, man. Schneider leaves the camp most days, just trying to get away from everyone else. Charlie Hodge obsessively reads his damp, ruined Bible. As the others weakened on their steady diet of wild meat, Miller's strength and endurance increased. Miller transforms from machine back to animal, and even finds contentment in their isolation. Williams compresses a huge stretch of time into something comprehensible. Miller hunts, Charlie reads, Schneider broods, and Andrews can't seem to stop thinking about Francine and of the person he was in Butcher's Crossing. What had he thought then? What had he been? How had he felt? He thought of himself now as a vague shape that did nothing, that had no identity. One day, Andrews spontaneously wanders the valley, trying to calm his restless mind. He forgets his snow blinders and very quickly becomes snowblind. All around him was whiteness which glittered with needle-like points of fire. The whiteness overwhelms him, cementing him with a sense of non-being, of weightlessness. He staggers back to camp, but it takes days for his vision to return. The snowblindness episode reminds me of a very famous chapter in Moby Dick in which Melville broods on the meaning of the color white. This is actually a chapter in Moby Dick. It's called The Whiteness of the Whale. Whiteness is not so much a color as the visible absence of color, and at the same time the concrete of all colors. It is for these reasons that there is such a dumb blankness, full of meaning, in a wide landscape of snows, a colorless, all color of atheism, from which we shrink. Perhaps the whiteness and blindness represent all that Andrews lacks. He came to nature to discover his true self, yet when he looks within, he finds a shapeless void. Jack Brenner writes, "Giving over to nature's subtle magnetism has not discovered a sure cohesion in the universe. Instead, Andrews begins to experience a more extravagant freedom than Thoreau ever imagined. The freedom of the void, this nothingness never leaves him. Months pass. Andrews is made aware of the passing of the months by the fact that at regular intervals, Schneider came up to him and asked him for his month's pay. Truly admirable levels of hater energy. In early April, the snow starts to melt, and the time seems to pass even slower as the men look forward to their departure. Miller forces them to keep waiting. If they take a chance and ride through the pass, they could risk a cave-in under feet of snow. The snow is melting, but not enough for Miller's satisfaction. Schneider grows increasingly furious the longer Miller makes them wait. They gather up their lean oxen, which have been roaming the valley all winter, smoke plenty of fish for the trip, and stack the hides in their wagon. 6 of the huge bales, laid in pairs, covered the bed of the wagon. Upon these, the men managed to boost 6 more, so that the bound hides rose to the height of a man above the sideboards of the wagon. Sort of like this. Miller insists they stack the bales some 12 feet high so that they return to Butcher's Crossing looking real victorious. Still, they only load some of the hides. 2 more wagon loads they'll have to come back and get later. They're carrying around 1,500 hides, but Miller guesses there's about 4,700 hides in total. That's 4,700 dead buffalo. And at $4 a piece, that's about $18,000. About $465,000 today. Miller says, that ain't bad for a winter of doing nothing, is it? So, they cross the mountain pass and make their slow descent, leaving behind their home for the past 7 months. The ground is muddy and the wagon load precarious. The men use ropes to keep it from toppling over. As the air gets warmer, Andrews discovers his own putrid stench. He can barely stand it. He hasn't bathed since before the snowfall, mind you, nor even taken off his clothes. When they hit the river, Andrews rips off his clothes and jumps into the icy water. In the early fall, when they had crossed at last, the river had been a thin trickle that barely covered the bed of rock. Now it stretched from bank to bank and cut away the earth opposite where they rested. Miller finds a safe crossing over the river, testing the depths with his horse, and Andrews follows on his own. Charlie Hodge rides the lead oxen with the load of hides behind him, while Schneider rides his horse slightly upstream. Andrews is kind of nervous at first watching this, but then understood the safety of the crossing. By the time the farthest oxen were insecure and had to struggle to maintain their footing, the other oxen would be in the shallows and could pull the main weight of the wagon. Just before the wagon makes it out of the river, Andrews spots something. A log, splintered at the downstream end, nearly as thick as a man's body and twice as long, bobbed like a matchstick and hurtled forward, half in and half out of the swirling water. Andrews, from the bank of the river, tries to warn Schneider, who's still crossing, but Schneider can't hear him. The splintered end of the log thrust into the side of Schneider's horse with a ripe, splitting thud that was clearly audible above the roar of the water. For an instant, the horse struggled to keep upright. Then the log tore away, and the horse gave a short, high scream of agony and fear, and fell sideways toward the wagon. Schneider went into the water as the horse fell. The horse turned completely over above Schneider, and for an instant the great gaping hole that had been its belly reddened the water around it. After slamming into Schneider's horse, the log smashes into the wagon, toppling it sideways. The oxen, the horse, and Schneider get dragged into the water. Buffalo hides exploded in all directions upon the water, and were rapidly borne out of sight. For perhaps a minute, the men who stood on the bank could see the oxen struggling head over heels in the water, and could see the smashed wagon turning and drifting into the distance. Then they could see nothing. Just like that, everything is gone. Andrews breaks down, sobbing for Schneider. Charlie Hodge simply says, "He lay with scarlet women, and he fornicated, and he blasphemed, and he took the name of the Lord in vain. It's God's will. God's will be done. Ultimately, Miller has the final word. The sooner we get away from here, the better it'll be. Like everything else, Miller faces the chaos at the heart of the world with a blank, unfeeling stare. It's late May. Miller, Andrews, and Charlie Hodge ride languidly into Butcher's Crossing. Nothing to show for their months away. The town, however, isn't exactly as they left it. It's oddly empty, strangely quiet. Miller remarks that something's wrong here, and John Williams holds us in total suspense. Despite their relative failure and the loss of Schneider, Miller is not in complete despair. They still have 2/3 of their hides stowed up on the mountains. They immediately go to old J.D. McDonald's hide trading business, but find stacks and stacks of buffalo hides cluttering the property. Inside, McDonald's office is a mess with papers strewn everywhere and no sign of McDonald. The three men go to the hotel. Everything feels deserted. The hotel lobby is grimy and covered in dust, and the man working there is new in town and has no idea who McDonald even is, nor why the town is deserted. Like his first night in Butcher's Crossing, Andrews prepares himself a bath in his room. He can barely recognize himself. He has a thick beard and hair down to his shoulders. His body covered with tiny unhealed insect bites, stung from the strong soap. He soaped his hair and beard and watched the black streams of water run back into the tub. His own stench, released by the cleansing he gave himself, rose from the water and made him hold his breath. He shaves his beard, cuts his hair, and inspects himself in the mirror. The upper half of his face was a bloodless brown, darker than his beard or hair. It had hardened in the weather so that he could see no expression and no identity where he looked. The three men head to the saloon to ask about McDonald, but the saloon is equally dead. However, a prostitute tells them that McDonald is staying in an old bunkhouse behind the saloon. They find McDonald alone there. 20 or 30 beds were scattered about the room. McDonald is a shell of his former self, trembling as Andrews approaches. He thought they all died up in the mountains and reacts unsurprisingly to the losses they suffered. Miller gets straight to business with McDonald, informing him that they have about 3,000 hides cached up in the mountains and that he expects to get paid for them when he returns. To that, McDonald says, "They'll be a comfort to you in your old age, and that's all they'll be." Miller is confused and growing angry. McDonald says hides aren't even worth 10 cents a piece anymore. He says, "The bottom's dropped out of the whole market. The hide business is finished for good, just like you're finished, Miller. And you're kind." McDonald himself bought 40,000 hides before the crash in the hide market, and now he can't sell them. He's completely broke. For the first time in the novel, we see Miller break into a blind fury. He can't comprehend it. If they had just come back 7 months earlier, they could have sold their hides and made a fortune. He shouts at McDonald, but McDonald tells Miller he's just as responsible for the crash as the other hunters. "You ruin yourself, you and your kind. Every day of your life, everything you do. Nobody can tell you what to do. No. You go your own way, stinking the land up with what you kill. You flood the market with hides and ruin the market, and then you come crying to me that I've ruined you. You're no better than the things you kill." Miller is about to storm out of there when Andrews tells him he wants a private word with McDonald. Miller tells him to do whatever the hell he wants. Our business is finished. From this point on, it's like Miller and Andrews are strangers to each other once again. We receive some dark wisdom from McDonald, who attempts to cobble together words to fill Andrews' sense of loss. You get born and you nurse on lies, and you get weaned on lies, and you learn fancier lies in school. You live all your life on lies, and then maybe when you're ready to die, it comes to you that there's nothing but yourself and what you could have done. Only you ain't done it because the lies told you there was something else. Then you know you could have had the world because you're the only one that knows the secret. Only then it's too late. You're too old. Andrews can't even argue with him. He tries to articulate the faith he used to feel, but nothing comes. He faces the void, feels the emptiness in his soul, and now follows all he has left, physical instinct. He leaves McDonald's shack and wanders blindly up above the saloon into the brothel, and up to Francine's door. She's still here in Butcher's Crossing. She's thrilled to see him. She thought he was dead. At first, she tells him he hasn't changed much, but after closer inspection, she changes her mind. His hands aren't soft anymore, that's for sure. Finally, after all this time, Andrews embraces Francine, and they have sex. What follows is like a dream to Andrews. For 5 days and nights, he and Francine languish in that dark room, the blinds closed tight. They have sex and eat and sleep. Andrews dissociates. Gradually, he came to look upon his frequent and desperate unions with Francine as if they were performed by someone else. As if from a distance, sightlessly, he observed himself and his sensations as he fulfilled his needs upon a body to which, meaninglessly, he attached a name. Lacking an understanding of his own soul, he longs for a connection with the soul of someone else, but he can't find it. At one point, Andrews leaves the room and finds Charlie Hodge at the bar. Charlie barely recognizes him and speaks in a monotone, drooling. He thinks they still haven't left for their trip to Colorado. Andrews turns from him in horror and returns to Francine's room, to her warm, comforting body. He tries explaining what he felt seeing Charlie like that. He tries to explain the whole hunting trip, but he can't find the words. He can't articulate the nothingness of which MacDonald described. Did it lurk hidden in everyone, waiting to spring out, waiting to devour and rend until there was left only the blankness he had seen and the blue stare that Charlie Hodge now had to give the world? That evening, Andrews thinks of Schneider, once alive, about what he would do with Francine if he were here. Andrews thinks of all the men Francine has slept with. He thinks of them without resentment now. He decides that he will leave Francine, that he will become a stranger to her, as he has now become a stranger to himself. Before falling asleep, Andrews hears shouting in the distance and the shadows of flames against the window curtains. He dresses, runs downstairs, and gathers with the other townspeople at the base of a huge inferno. MacDonald's hide trading business is on fire, along with the piles and piles of wasted buffalo hides. It was Miller on a horse which reared and screamed in terror at the flames, but which was held under control by the sheer force of Miller's strength. Absent of purpose now, Miller devolves to his primal nature. Pure destruction. Andrews learns that Miller has started this fire, that he plans to burn every last buffalo hide. MacDonald screams and chases Miller, but he can't do anything. Though the hides are worth nothing now, MacDonald still clings to the purpose he once had, to the man he once was. In his fury, Miller seems to gain superhuman strength. One of the townspeople remarks, "Them bales must weigh 300-400 pounds." Miller throws everything into the inferno. Miller's face was blackened by the smoke, his eyebrows were almost completely burned away, and his hair was crisped and scorched. When his work is done, he rides into the distance. Ever the loyal partner, Charlie Hodge, chases after him, and they both disappear into the darkness. By morning, MacDonald's business is a charred wreck. Andrews returns quietly to Francine's room and stands there, watching her sleep. He could hardly recall now the passion that had drawn him to this room and this flesh, as if by a subtle magnetism, nor could he recall the force of that other passion which had impelled him halfway across a continent into a wilderness where he had dreamed he could find, as in a vision, his unalterable self. Almost without regret, he could admit now the vanity from which those passions had sprung. He puts some money on Francine's dresser, retrieves his horse from the stable, and leaves Butcher's Crossing for good. He leaves with a similar sense of directionlessness he had at the start of the novel. It's unclear how much he's changed. Andrews realizes now that he will never return back east. He never can. In the final line of the book, he rode forward without hurry and felt behind him the sun slowly rise and harden the air. John Williams brings his characters to the edge of the abyss. Some don't make it out alive, like Schneider, while some lose their minds, like Charlie Hodge. Through the entire novel, Miller faces the abyss with a stoic sheen. He becomes a machine, committing violence in a process for which he is merely a pawn. He sees himself as an individual, but he's just another in the long story of mass destruction in North America. Miller today, I like to imagine, might be a crypto bro, a tech guru, someone insisting on individual exceptionalism, chasing boom cycles, only to fail like millions of others. Behind Miller's robotic exceptionalism is a human being, an animal on the brink of madness. Andrews might actually be the least damaged by the whole ordeal, even though he lost half his money. He sees the abyss, the void within himself, and accepts his change. He will never return to his idealism, but he will continue life wiser, more accepting of other people. He understands true pity now. So, is the book as bloody as Blood Meridian? Hard to say. Probably not. I mean, certainly maybe for animal deaths, but it's a novel so vivid in its detail, so realistic in its portrayal of a buffalo hunt. One becomes overwhelmed when truly surreal and horrifying moments happen. The tragedy of the book is not the near extinction of the buffalo, it's the banality of our characters' willingness to participate. Miller is not some maniac hell-bent on killing. He's an inversion of Captain Ahab. Where Captain Ahab is a mad poet, Miller is a blunt instrument, a cog in a machine. He's just a businessman. He takes care of his team, he guides Andrews, and leads nearly all of them to safety. So then, I guess I need to talk about the movie? Let's get into it. Butcher's Crossing is a 2022 film adapted from Williams' novel. It's directed by Gabe Polsky and stars a bald Nicolas Cage as Miller and Fred Hetchinger as Andrews. There's a lot of good in this adaptation, but unfortunately, the most glaring issue is budget. And I feel bad pointing that out because I'm glad to see lower budget films get made, and they make excellent use of what they have. Much of it was filmed on Blackfeet Nation in Montana and features terrific footage of the Blackfeet's own buffalo. But this story is epic, and it deserves an epic budget. And getting crunched within an hour, 45-minute runtime doesn't really help. The first half hour of the movie's great, but once they get on the road, things slow down fast. And while the adaptation captures the themes in broad strokes, you get the sense that the director is really worried the story is boring. An adaptation would be difficult under any circumstances. So much of what makes the book work is in the hard physical details, the mundane processes of setting up camp, rounding up buffalo, making bullets, building shelter in the snow. A director would need careful, calculating focus to depict this on screen. Instead, Polsky goes for a broader psychological tale, more in the vein of The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. He's more interested in the actors' faces than in the guns and the tools. In the film, nature is just the foil to Miller's human dysfunction. Part of this, I think, is Cage's problem. From the beginning, Cage plays Miller as a hulking, brooding maniac, obsessively shaving his head, even pressuring Andrews into funding the hunt. In the book, there's nothing really crazy about Miller. He's brutal in his killing, but that's shown as an inhuman, mechanized process. Cage gives us a psychologically damaged character, someone all too human, and thus we get a stereotype. The script doesn't really help. At one point, Cage pulls out a pistol, threatening Andrews if he tries to give a dying woman and her kids some water. And this is early in the movie. This guy is clearly crazy from the start. Nothing can surprise us after he does something like that. In fact, we suspect him to get even more crazy, but it doesn't really happen. The director, either due to budgetary constraints or pacing problems, is constantly giving us these Terrence Malick-esque nature shots, montages that try to force the audience into feeling the hardship of the journey, but it never works. It's all very film schooly. When the party is searching for water, we don't get any information. We don't see how much water they have left. We don't see how they preserve it. We just get hazy montages until finally, hey, we found some water. On a positive note, Fred Hetchinger was inspired casting for Andrews. He was the little brother in the first season of The White Lotus, and he's perfect in this. Captures all of Andrews' youthful optimism. Unfortunately, they give him some of the worst lines in the movie. To compress his whole philosophy of life, he has these hippie moments where he shouts into the trees and says, "This is God, Charlie." Yeah, it's very cringy and simplistic and betrays the novel's subtlety, especially about, transcendentalism. The buffalo hunt is executed well enough. There's a good amount of gore, and it definitely is not for the squeamish. But that's where the positive notes end for me. All of the subtle, intricate, realistic details are ignored in favor of forced interpersonal drama. After getting snowed in the mountains, the actors spend a lot of time on a cheap-looking soundstage shouting at each other. Charlie Hodge starts poisoning Schneider with strychnine for some reason. In the movie, Schneider is some kind of bandit or criminal instead of just being like a selfish bore. So Schneider finds out about Charlie poisoning him, and he beats Charlie to death, smashes his face in, and it's so ridiculous. It felt like the director going, man, there's a lot of nothing in these snow scenes. Let's have a murder. So Schneider and Miller and Andrews leave the mountains together, and instead of what would be a dangerous and/or expensive river scene, the wagon just breaks randomly. Instead of losing all their hides in the river, the wagon just breaks randomly, and Schneider slowly rolls off a cliff with all of the hides. It feels so random. It's actually really funny. We don't see where the hides go. Andrews and Miller are just like, okay, they're gone. The movie has a constant brooding score, so when things do go wrong, we expect it with little shock. The tone for the whole movie is like a horror movie, but the subject never hits that frenzy, It's not supposed to be a horror movie, it's a Western. The rest of the movie is fine and plays like the book, but by the end of it, we're left wondering why? What is the perspective here? Williams' book is so finely tuned, so well crafted, there's no lack of meaning. Before the credits roll, some text explains the destruction of the buffalo in the 1800s, and even shows that famous picture I showed at the start of this video. It makes the movie feel like an environmental plea, but so much of it is played as a psychological drama. All the killing feels personally motivated by Miller, not the process of a cold, so-called rational system of supply and demand. The effectiveness is blunted by the text of the movie. I can really only picture two directors pulling off this adaptation. Well, three, technically. First, the Coen brothers. I think they could capture the dark irony in the book, and they kind of already have in movies like No Country for Old Men and True Grit. Their precision would match perfectly with Williams' sense of detail. And the other director is Werner Herzog. I don't suspect he'd make the most faithful adaptation, but I imagine he'd capture the horrifying power of nature. He already has in movies like Aguirre and Grizzly Man. And as for capturing the dark irony, watch Aldo and tell me he couldn't pull it off. Unfortunately, we won't ever get those director's visions, so we have a decent, serviceable one right here. And you know what? If it gets viewers to discover the book, I'm a happy camper. The fact that they attempted to make this movie is admirable in its own right. Adapting any book to a movie or TV show is a daunting task. I'm really fascinated by the big and small choices writers and directors have to make. One of my favorite book-to-movie adaptations is Jurassic Park. In Lindsay Ellis's Jurassic Park Turns 30, she dissects how a story can start as a screenplay, become a book, then turn back into a movie. I never knew how much the writing in the Jurassic Park novel was influenced by its early development as a screenplay. This video, along with a ton of other exclusive content from your favorite creators, is available on Nebula. It's where all your favorite creators like Big Joel, H Bomber Guy, Legal Eagle have free reign to create exciting, bold videos free from the YouTube algorithm. Just recently, I joined Nebula as a creator. They let me in. It was one of the most exciting opportunities of my career, knowing I'll have more of an ability to share cool book-related videos there that might die in the YouTube algorithm. Some of my favorite creators, like my friend Tim Hickson, aka Hello Future Me, make Nebula exclusive content and early access videos. You could have seen this Butcher's Crossing video ad-free on Nebula a week ago. I can't wait to show you all what I have planned for this year. When you sign up for Nebula, you aren't only getting access to amazing content, you're supporting me and my channel. Nebula is undergoing some of its biggest changes ever with a recent UI design that makes discovering new content easier. And with a new slate of Nebula original content, including Abigail Thorne's short film Dracula's Ex-Girlfriend coming this summer, there's no shortage of exciting stuff to watch. If you sign up using my link, go.nebula.tv/mancarryingthing, or use the link below, you can support me directly and get Nebula for 40% off annual plans. It says a little over $250 a month. But if you happen to be a Nebula superfan, they're also selling lifetime memberships for $300. No gimmicks, just Nebula for life. Thank you for watching, and thanks as always for supporting the channel. And thank you to Nebula for sponsoring this video. All right, so there we go. I want to thank everyone for watching. This was a labor of love, and it took a really long time to write the script. I just want to thank all the patrons for supporting the channel. Support on Patreon and through Nebula really helps me fund and make these long videos where I dissect books and TV, and this is what I'm really passionate about doing. So I would love to keep doing this. So thank you for the support. Thanks for watching. Read some books. Take care. Bye-bye.